Welcome to the SAFeTY Chronicles, exploring how to keep people and pets safe from the cycle of interpersonal violence. I am your host, Allie Phillips, founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together, the SAFeTY Program, a nonprofit organization working with domestic violence shelters to eliminate the pet housing barrier to safety. As the founder, I have led the global movement in helping domestic violence shelters create on-site pet housing while elevating the criminal justice response to how animal abuse links to crimes against people. I am a former prosecuting attorney, internationally recognized legal expert, and public speaker, award-winning author, and advocate for protecting vulnerable victims. In this podcast, we will explore how and why animals are harmed in the cycle of family violence and the human-animal bond that keeps victims in harm's way with their pets. Guest speakers and I will share strategies for shelters and professionals working to safeguard survivors, why pet-inclusive sheltering is life-saving, and safety tips for those who need help. None of the content will be graphic. If you are in harm's way, please contact your nearest domestic violence shelter or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Let's get started. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. I have my cup of joe in my cat coffee cup, and I want to start talking about how to help shelters start a SAFeTY program. It's actually easier than many shelters believe it will be, and that's the foundation of the SAFeTY program, is making it simple, making it doable. And so I want to talk about assessing the need. Is there a need in your community? So if your community does not have a pet inclusive domestic violence shelter, when you assess your community need, you will find that it's an important option to have for the safety of your community. So when domestic violence survivors are experiencing violence and there are pets in the home and there's children in the home, there is an increased rate of child abuse and animal abuse. The research is very solid and very clear on this. And I'm going to get into a little bit of the research in a minute. So if the adult victim, the adult survivor, cannot leave the situation with kids and with pets, the abuse can continue, which creates unhealthy and dangerous communities. It can create a cycle of violence, which then children can replicate. And when abusive homes are off the radar of social service agencies, the violence continues. And this is where having a pet inclusive domestic violence shelter can be the first step toward safety, toward healing, and toward accountability of the offender. Here's how shelters can assess the need for pet housing. Number one, understanding the research that has been growing for decades, and it's very consistent across the board in what it tells us. So approximately 10 million women and men are victims of interpersonal violence in the United States each year. And as high as 65% will delay or refuse going into shelter if they cannot take their pets with them. So the National Network to End Domestic Violence does an annual survey every year, and they take one 24-hour period in the month of September, and they assess what is happening in the domestic violence service industry. So we're about ready to get the 2023 results, but I have the results from September 7th of 2022. 1,642 shelters out of 1,955 participated in this survey. 79,335 victims in one 24-hour period received services. 44,882 sought safe housing, and 12,692 had unmet housing needs. My question is, how many of those housing needs were unmet because they were pet related? And this is something that I have been in conversation with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm really hoping it can be added to their 2024 survey, because I believe it's a very high unmet need. So when it comes to child abuse, the most recent child maltreatment report, which is it is the data that we all work off of in the child abuse arena. And so the child maltreatment report in 2022 found that almost 559,000 children in the US were abused and neglected. That's high. That's a high rate. And then when it comes to animal abuse statistics, the FBI has just started tracking, but we know going back to, I believe it was 1988, it was one of the first research studies that linked child abuse and animal abuse, and it discovered that 88% of homes with physically abused children also included the abuse or neglect of the family pet. And about 66% of homes in the US have at least one pet. That's almost 87 million pets. So the numbers are very high when you think about those who are experiencing abuse and have a pet. That's 2/3 of your community that has a pet. And I want to read this quote from the executive director of Quigley House, which is in Clay County, Florida. And Sharon, the executive director, sent me an email one day, and she said, "The most important fact is the ability to shelter pets because we know that domestic violence victims often won't leave their abusers because of fear of what might happen to their pets." And that succinctly summarizes why the SAFeTY program exists. So number one is understanding the research when you are assessing the need in your community. Number two is facing that reality of the research. When domestic violence victims with pets are not able to access safe housing with their pets, and they don't have friends or family able to take their pets in, they are faced with three options. Number one, stay in the abusive home, exposing themselves, their children, and their pets to harm or even death. Number two, experience homelessness. There are far too many survivors living in their cars or living on the streets. Or number three, leave their pets behind when they go into shelter. Now, here's the thing. I don't think any of us would ever expect a domestic violence survivor to leave their children behind. Why would we expect them to leave their pets behind? None of these options are okay with the SAFeTY program, and it's why we exist. So the number three thing as part of this assessment in your community is understanding the emotional need for survivors to be housed with pets after they have experienced trauma. They've lost everything. They've had to leave their home. They've left everything behind. It's understanding the human-animal bond. It's recognizing that we treat pets as members of the family. We buy them birthday gifts, we buy them holiday gifts, we throw birthday parties. People send their pets to doggy daycare like they send their human children to daycare. And there is an extensive body of research documenting the benefits of the human-animal bond for physical, emotional, and mental support. Number four is assessing your community need. How do you know if domestic violence victims in your community need housing for their pets? Well, you have to ask. That's the thing. If you don't ask, you don't know. Conduct a survey on your shelter hotline to gather local data. I can give you all the national and international data that you need. If you are applying for grants or you're going to your community, I can help you with that. Just reach out. But it's really important to conduct a survey locally. And there's no better place than on your hotline, because those are the people in need right now who need to get into shelter. They need services. And this is where you can ask, do you have pets? How many pets do you have? Do you have a safe place to take your pets if you come into shelter? Have your pets been threatened or harmed? It's that simple, my friends. It's that simple. And when you can conduct a survey on your hotline, whether it's for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 6 months, a year, you decide. But you're going to get data that you can then take to your community, to local community funders, to grant makers, to state grant makers to donors, and you can tell them, we conducted a survey and this is what our community needs. Remember, 2/3 of America has a pet. I wish I had the numbers for international countries, but they just don't exist. So the other thing that you can do is conduct a survey of your shelter residents and your shelter staff. Ask them, did you leave a pet behind for the residents? Ask how many in your shelter right now left a pet behind, or maybe had a pet that had been abused, maybe was killed, maybe the pet ran away, maybe they were forced to give away the pet, take the pet to an animal shelter. And ask your staff, are you hearing from the residents that they had pets? They had pets left behind. They had pets that were abused. Talk to them. They will tell you what they are hearing. And it's also important to go to your partners. Go to a local animal shelter in your community and have a discussion about whether they are assessing if pets are being surrendered due to domestic violence. Many survivors are just not going to say that they're surrendering a pet due to domestic violence in order to keep the pet safe. But ask them, do they have staff that is able to determine this information, able to ask the questions, to do some sort of safety assessment? Meet with your child protection agencies and your child advocacy centers and your justice centers, if you have one in your community, and ask them to incorporate questions about animals in their assessments and their interview protocols. When you can ask children about animals in the home, this is where you're going to get really good information about what's happening. Talk to law enforcement, your first responders, and even prosecutors. As a former prosecutor, I always asked my crime victims on any abusive case whether they had animals in the home. And I was surprised at the information that I got that never showed up in a police report. The information that I received about abuse that happened in the home that they were never asked about, nor did they offer the information. And I was actually able to amend many of my criminal complaints to add animal abuse. So talk with law enforcement, talk with the first responders, EMTs, fire department, prosecutors, and then garner support from your board of directors with all this information. Go to your community leaders. Let them know that it's time for your community to have a pet inclusive domestic violence shelter. And now you have all of this awesome data that is local, and you can supplement it with the national and the international research studies. Because failing to consider pets in emergency and transitional housing is a barrier to safety. Just plain and simple. I'm just going to say it. It is a barrier to safety. 2/3 of American homes have a pet. If you're not helping those who have pets, you have created a barrier to safety. And this is where we're here to help. And I want you to listen to my next podcast because I'm going to talk about housing options. So, if you do not work with a domestic violence shelter, please send this podcast to your local domestic violence shelter. I will help them assess their need. I will help them with this process. This is what the SAFeTY program is all about. This is why we're here. We're here to help, and we are free to domestic violence shelters. So thank you for listening, and we appreciate you being here. Please like this podcast and share it. Share it, because we need to help more people who are in harm's way who have children and pets. Thanks for being here.